Hello, Zerglings and Zoomers, my name is TBSkine, and a very old but consistent feature of the League of Legends universe is the malevolent presence of the Void. In the early days, like much of League of Legends lore, it was very poorly defined, and it has kind of remained so. In the same way that Demacia was good guy Gondor Fantasy Kingdom and Noxus was Sauron Evil Fantasy Kingdom, the Void was generic scary monster dimension whose purpose was to justify the existence of monsters like Cho'Gath, Kog'Maw, and Kha'Zix in the game. 13 years hence, the Void has undergone a few quiet expansions and redefinitions, but still remains, at best, fairly vaguely defined. There was a brief period where Riot seemed to be gearing up to introduce sci-fi elements to League of Legends lore with the Galactic Empire of Targon, and both the Voidborn and the Darkin played the roles of essentially hostile alien invaders in that concept. This was quietly dropped at some point or another, presumably there was an internal discussion about it, and the Void has eventually settled into its current concept as a sort of existential mirror universe. It is a frozen state of essentially perfect order, where nothing changes and nothing exists. No things are relative to one another. There is no time, there is no physics, there is no reality governed by any laws. Physical reality, the real world, is to the Void as bright light and metal music played at maximum volume is to a light sleeper. It is this unignorable, screeching cacophony of chaos that disturbs the peace and silence and perfection of the Void's stasis. In the Void, there are intelligences, consciousnesses of a sort, who had been eternally restful and unaware, not even conscious of their own existence, until the emergence of reality very rudely and loudly wakes them up. It forces them into cognition and awareness, and they don't like it. I can relate to that. And hence, Void monsters. The Void wants to snuff out reality, to make everything silent again, to restore its own perfectly ordered oblivion, and to that end, it probes the walls between dimensions for holes into the physical realm and sends things through. Void things, which crash into the laws of physics and contort into whatever shape they can hold, screaming in the absolute agony of being forced to exist. Again, that's strangely relatable. Their mission and primary drive once inside of reality is to tear it apart, bit by bit, to snuff out existence like the ocean snuffs out a candle. The Void found a way through in the Freljord, corrupting Lissandra with fear so that she would use her magic to let them in. It found a way through in the deep, dark abyss of the sea, where Nami's people hold it at bay using powerful moon magic. It has found ways through in the celestial reaches of space, where Targon enslaved Aurelian Sol to use his star magic to seal the breaches, and it has found a way through in the Shuriman province of Icathia, whose desperate mages summoned the Void in the hopes of destroying the despotic Shuriman Empire. It did not go well for them, but as a bonus upside to all of that, the Ascended God Warriors who are exposed to the Void are so profoundly traumatized by the experience that, with immortal lifespans and no therapy available, they eventually spiral into becoming insane, blood-soaked demon monsters known as the Darkin, so that's cool! The current state of the Void is that it is one of the world-ending threats whose dark shadow is hanging quietly over Runeterra. In the Freljord, the Watchers sleep deep under the true ice, guarded by Lissandra, always threatening to awaken. The rift in the deep under Nami's home could burst open at any second if she doesn't find Diana, the aspect of the moon, and receive a moon pearl from her to seal it with. It is a ticking time bomb, adding constant apocalyptic tension to the world of Runeterra. And if the League of Legends MMO ever actually comes out, I am willing to bet money that the main plot, or at least one of the expansions, will be about repelling a Void invasion or two. Of course, if the Void is to play the part of villain in a plot, there is the problem that the Void is not a particularly compelling villain. I mean, it's scary for certain existential horror and all of that, and Negaverse and stuff, but it's not got much of a personality, does it? Nor has it spawned any really great villainous personalities. Cho'Gath, Kog'Maw, Kha'Zix, and rek'sai aren't exactly great orators, and vel'koz, Lissandra, and Malzahar's roles are those of minions. They're villains, but they're not the main villain. They're not the real threat. The Void, when boiled down to its simplest definition, is just a nega-dimension that wants you dead. There's not really any complexity to it, no flair, no real menace outside of the existential horror. So, to be a compelling antagonist for a narrative, the Void is in really rather desperate need of a good supervillain.
devoured this city. I will devour your world. You disappoint me. I am not somebody's void spawn. I am so much more. I am the end of your world and the beginning of mine.
Oh. Yeah, that'll work. So, the reason we did that little recap on the history and the state of the Void in the intro is because Bel'veth should very much be understood as an extension of that. She's an attempt, I think, first of all, to give the Void a charismatic villain character with a strong personality, to give a face, ironically, to a part of the universe that is inherently kinda faceless. Second, she's a way to explore the nature of the Void as more than just this flatly described universal evil, more than just the monster dimension where monsters come from. So, as the Void reaches into reality to try and snuff it out, it affects reality, it corrupts it, it colonizes it. But as reality touches the Void is affected as well. And this kind of goes back to the very beginning. Remember, the entities in the Void began as completely unconscious, unaware even of themselves. The existence of reality forces them into awareness, and thus it changes them. Bel'veth is an extension and consequence of that mutual changing. As her biography puts it, she's the result of an allergic reaction between the Void and reality. As the Void interacts with Runeterra, it develops in itself a sort of cancer, a pocket of the Void that has been corrupted by reality. As the Void absorbs and annihilates the physical universe, the remains collect in this pocket, fueling its transformation and acting as the basis for its mutation in imitation of life, as it were. And as this corrupted pocket of the Void becomes more and more lifelike, it begins to need things in the same way that life does. It begins to need purpose. It begins to need a leader. Bel'veth is created to be that leader, formed out of the collected memories and experiences of all the citizens of a port city swallowed in one gulp by the Void. She contains the collected knowledge and analysis of millions of years of deconstructed reality and history, which makes her more sentient, more sapient, and far more powerful than just about any other Void entity that exists in Runeterra. Bel'veth thinks of herself as the embodiment of the Void, its next natural evolution, its necessary queen. But it is not yet a complete evolution. It needs more information, it needs more material, it needs more. And so, in order to complete her evolution, the Void's evolution, Bel'veth intends to consume everything. All of reality. In so doing, she would turn all of Runeterra into an extension of the Void, and thus an extension of herself. It would be a monolithic merging of the unchanging oneness of the Void with the mercurial, diverse chaos of reality. This is her endgame. This is the primary driving motivation that animates her. From Bel'veth's perspective, she has already won. She's supremely confident in her victory. She has run the numbers, as it were, on the total arc of history, and she believes that it all adds up to a total victory for her. Because of that, she believes that she is above lying, above deception, and above questioning and doubt. When she draws Kai'Sa into her domain, she leads the conversation by essentially just making statements. I am going to win. You can do nothing to stop me. I am a power beyond your comprehension, and so on and so on. It's classic villain monologue stuff, but delivered with all the cold and unconcerned dispassion of a HAL 9000. The one thing she seems to fear, though, is, weirdly enough, the Void itself. Specifically, Bel'veth is worried about the Watchers. The Watchers are the void entities that are trapped in ice in the Freljord. They sleep under Lyssandra's watchful guardianship as she desperately tries to delay their awakening. And to hear Bel'veth tell it, like her, the Watchers were changed by their interaction with reality. But where Bel'veth developed hunger and a desire to absorb and integrate reality into herself, the Watchers only developed a deeper and more desperate hatred of it. If they awaken and overrun Runeterra, they will end all of existence, and since Bel'veth wants to eat existence, that doesn't work for her. But rather than travel herself to the Freljord to destroy them, she sends Kai'Sa to do it, promising that in return for that favor, she will spare humanity from being consumed for some period of time. Bel'veth believes that the victory of the Void is a mathematical certainty, but not necessarily the Void as represented by her, apparently. And in this context, it's worth noting that the representations of Bel'veth we've seen so far are either from her perspective, as in her biography, or feature her only in moments of control and triumph. Her color story, the animated short, none of them feature Bel'veth under pressure or being called out or doubted. Bel'veth is tremendously powerful and supremely confident in her own inevitable victory, but she lives in the Lavender Sea, which is this sprawling, ethereal, otherworldly pile of garbage. As Kai'Sa walks through it, she sees a chaotic mess of partial buildings, ghostly limbs, sewn together semi-objects, and pearlescent structures in the crude likeness of human beings walking through a garden. Bel'veth has absorbed millions of human lives, and yet for all of her power and self-assuredness, the best imitation of reality she can muster is a half-assed children's drawing generated by a machine learning AI. She absorbed a whole city, but she cannot faithfully remake even a tenth of it. So perhaps her omnipotent self-assuredness shouldn't just be accepted as a coldly objective view of reality. Maybe we're meant to understand that she is wrong. Bel'veth absorbed a lot of humanity to become as sapient as she is, and arrogance is a very human quality. Thematically, too, Bel'veth could be seen as a sort of monstrous caricature of a narcissist. She sees everything around her as an extension of herself, or a potential extension of herself, and is unwilling or unable to think in terms that allow for flaws in her. So she looks out on the nightmare trash pile that is the Lavender Sea and sees a triumphant future to come. She looks at herself and sees the inevitable future of the Void, the queen of all reality. She doesn't lie, but that's not the same as actually knowing and understanding the truth. And it should be noted that for all of her posturing, all of her philosophical proclamations about being the future of the Void, the next evolution, a paradigm shift, someone who was developed beyond its primitive roots, for all her faux philosophizing about the inevitability of her victory, what she actually wants is to eat reality, which is exactly the same thing that all the other Void monsters want. She talks a big game about how special and different she is, but ultimately, her motivation and her goals are essentially exactly the same. And if we see Bel'veth less as an omnipotent void god whose insurmountable power assures her victory, and more as a tremendously powerful but deluded, self-obsessed monster whose monumental self-aggrandizing arrogance is cover for the same bottomless empty greed and hunger that animates every other void monster, well, that gives us an interesting framework through which to interpret her. In the development phase, Bel'veth was not planned as a monster champion. In her early concepts, she was rendered out much more as a skinny, sexy, generically pretty fantasy babe with some monstrous void theming. And for all that I am in favor of hot babes with tentacles, I think they made the right call by not going in that particular direction. The legacy of that initial direction remains in her current design in the form of Bel'veth's false face, a beautiful and otherworldly appendage that she extrudes from the top of her head. She supports the illusion of that face by drawing her manta ray wings around her like a cloak, imitating the shape of shoulders and using her stingers to affect the shape of legs under her billowing membrane of skin. The effect is that when you read Bel'veth as a human, she looks very much like a villainous fantasy empress, unnaturally tall, with spiky shoulders, an imperious cape, and regal posture. There's a sense of dignity to her. And that is a demonstration of an effect that I have mentioned before, which is pareidolia. This is the tendency of the human brain to identify patterns, like seeing a shape of an elephant in the clouds or taking a Rorschach test. Pareidolia is the reason why you can look at this chair and see a face, even though this chair categorically does not have a face. But there's nothing the human brain loves more than to identify human patterns. It's also why we can look at a colon and parenthesis and somehow see a smile. And this is why, even though Bel'veth doesn't actually have shoulders, even though she doesn't actually have legs, and even though her false head looks weird on closer inspection, and even though her anatomy wouldn't make any sense, and even though there is an obvious mouth with jaws on her stomach, we still look at this, and the immediate reaction of our brains is,
"Oh yeah, that's a human."
But the face is fake, and as soon as it's removed, her entire character design reads very differently. Now, we see the four eyes and mandibled jaw, the yonic abyss of her mouth, the manta ray wings, and the bony horns instead. And whatever else you may think of Bel'veth, I think it's a pretty neat little design trick to essentially create two characters in one, and allow for a total transformation of a character design and how it reads, simply by just removing one crucial element that the audience is predisposed to fixate on. It's not a magic trick, it's technique and it's craft, but it's genuinely quite clever. This character design switching trick, though, begs a pretty important question. Why bother with this? Or rather, why would she bother with this? Why do all of this human pretending, all of this anglerfish trickery? Especially if Bel'veth thinks of herself as this transcendent being who's above lies and deception, who merely states reality as it is? Well, then why all of this posturing? Why have a false face? Why wear a disguise? Well, I can think of a couple of possible answers. One possible answer is the sex sells argument. The argument that champions that have pretty faces, even if they're technically not real faces, do better in terms of engagement, which is the metric that Riot has admitted openly is their primary objective with their champion designs. Riot wants every single champion to be popular and enticing, and giving it a pretty face is a sort of shortcut to boosting that metric. From that perspective, it seems likely that even though Bel'veth changed from a human to a monster in development, the developers were never fully allowed to get rid of her hot woman appeal because that's what the business side wants. And there may be some truth to that interpretation. That sort of thing happens all the time in the game industry, and Riot certainly has a less than spotless history when it comes to interfering with the creative freedom of their staff in the name of not just making a good product, which generates profit, but making more profit, always more profit, always more engagement. The line must go up forever, you see, because anything else in the business realm of capitalism is somehow a failure. The other, less cynical way to look at it is to say, okay, we have spotted a contradiction in the design. Let's assume it's there on purpose. And if it is there on purpose, what is it meant to do? Which is where we come back to the interesting framework that we established at the end of the lore section. Bel'veth is a void monster with delusions of grandeur. She has absorbed the human condition of arrogance, the human tendency to lie to ourselves, and she has absorbed human vanity. She aspires to remake reality in her own image, and thinks of herself as an evolved queen of the void, but she is wrong. What she actually is a void monster, the same as all of the other void monsters, driven by the same hunger and the same need to consume. All her imperial pretensions are just a flimsy cover for her actual true nature. And through that lens, the contradiction in the character design becomes storytelling. Why does Bel'veth bother with the fake face and the pretending? Well, because that's who she is. Because she's vain. Because she's trying to imitate a reality, our reality, that she fundamentally doesn't actually really understand. Because she's pretending to be more sophisticated than she really is. The false front is a glamorous, intimidating empress building her empire. The truth underneath is a giant mouth with wings, a monster defined entirely by its empty hunger. Now, I'm personally fully ready to believe that at some point internally at Riot, someone had to pitch Bel'veth as sexy girl boss champion, because girl boss characters can sell sexy skins, and that's how we justify this thing economically. but I am not willing to believe that that is the whole of it. I think there is a point to the contradiction. I think it is part of the storytelling. I think we're meant to read Bel'veth's biography, which says that she never lies, and then look at her character design, which is based entirely around a visual lie, and notice that her actions contradict her propaganda and contradict her self-understanding. Now, this defense of the character design against the criticism of the contradiction does depend on Riot to actually, explore it with narrative. Like, they've laid the groundwork for it, but if this is the central concept of our Voidborn supervillain, that they are a liar even if they don't know it, then we need more than just Bel'veth having 1.5 arrogant conversations with Kaisa. It needs to be explored. She needs to be actually challenged on that. Speaking of challenges, it's challenging to pay the rent, and it is challenging to write a good segue, so I'm just going to tell you directly that this video was sponsored by Skillshare. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of classes for people who want to explore their creativity. If there's something you want to learn how to do, odds are pretty good that Skillshare can help. And the first 1,000 people to use the link in my description will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. Skillshare offers video series on self-organizing and prioritizing, including taking care of your mental health while trying to get work done. With a subscription, the service is ad-free, with new premium classes launching each week, which are fully subtitled in Spanish, Portuguese, French, and German. And since we discussed some criticism of the character animation in this episode, why not study up on its fundamentals with Johannes Fest's series on the basics of hand-drawn animation? He takes you through techniques that are found at the core of every piece of animation you have ever seen, from Pixar to 12-episode crummy gotcha commercials masquerading as anime, making it all accessible and understandable in theory and in practice. Skillshare has this and dozens of other series besides on every creative endeavor under the sun, so once again, use the link in my description for 1 month of free access and start exploring your own creativity. And so we stray from the safe harbor of a properly scripted video, and you join me in the roiling seas of unscripted analysis. And as I often do for these animation segments, we'll start with the idle animation, because I find that that is a great place to start taking a look at a character's acting. The idle animation is what a champion does when you're not telling them to do anything else. It's essentially like, what if you leave them alone if they don't have any job to do, if they're not fighting? How do they behave when stuff is just like not happening? And Bel'veth's idle animation has a few variations to it. Like, it's not just this over and over again, but this base idle animation that we're looking at right now is already establishing one interesting thing about the way this champion is animated. And if you're paying attention, you've probably spotted it. She's blinking, but only the eyes on her shoulders. Only the true eyes, the real ones. The fake face that's hanging out up here, absolutely no blinking action. No motion in it either. Like, there's no gesture going on. The eyes aren't darting anywhere. She's not turning her head in any way, shape, or form. It's not doing it. It's completely stiff. Whereas down here with the eyes, we get this asynchronous, like this desynchronized blinking motion that sort of happens at various points on the character in different places. And that desynchronicity, like that lack of synchronization, gives it a more, first of all, sort of an animalistic feel. It's kind of like how a lizard or a frog would blink, right? But also gives it a more organic feel as compared to the absolute stone-faced stillness of the fake face on top of the body. And that continues into the variations as well. This one especially I like because, once again, we have the blinking only happening on the real face down below, but also pay attention to the timing here. If I slow this down for a second, do you see how when Bel'veth turns to look over here, it's the real head that is turning first, and the fake face essentially follows as a sort of afterthought. So the real head is doing the work of looking in the direction, but what happens in the next motion that Bel'veth is about to take is that this head leads. You can see how that sort of tilts over to the side and then leads the body over to the other side. And what I take away from that is that the performance here is meant to be essentially that Bel'veth is puppeteering that head on top of her body, but she's not doing it quite as consistently as you would expect if it was actually like a body part that she uses. Pay attention to what the head does when she looks down like that as well. Do you see that? The stiffness of that motion right there. And that's something that happens again and again and again with the way that her fake head is animated, is that there is a certain stiffness of motion to it, a certain sort of rigid unnaturalness in there that sort of gives the game away that this head is really meant to be understood as a fake. And that begins already in her idle animations. That acting choice about the fake head continues into, for example, her joke animation. Now, the model viewer isn't rendering the full scope of it. What actually happens is that she spawns in one of her little void fishes and she gives a like, oh, who's a precious little void fish kind of joke voice line, right? But even here, pay attention to the way that the two faces move, because interestingly, there is a little bit of expression on the face, on the fake face here. Like I think it does put on a little bit of a smile there, but pay attention to how lively and animated the real face actually is. Like the way that like that little orange section on her shoulders is like brought up to act as a lower eyelid for the bigger expression. The way that her horns actually deform and are used to generate expression in the way that the character moves. Like, there's so much cartoonish animation happening with the real face, and pay attention by contrast to how the fake face moves. Pay attention to the sort of stiff, unnatural way that it kind of flops around. Now, the animation looks a little bit janky right now because we're going really slow, but pay attention to the sort of weird lolling about that the fake head does as the real face is concerned with, like, looking at the little fish that it's summoned. Especially here. Like, when she does that motion up, pay attention to the way that the fake head just kind of falls over forwards and sort of gets jiggled around like it's essentially a dead appendage that Bel'veth isn't paying attention to. Like, that little acting choice is there, and it persists into things like Bel'veth's laugh, for example. Right? You see it? We have this laugh animation where, when the actual laughter is happening, you can see the lower mandibles of Bel'veth herself moving. You can see the face, the real one, doing some acting to communicate that feeling, but the head, it just kind of flops over to the side, like the head of a wooden doll, and just kind of jiggles as the body itself is doing the actual laughing motion. The same thing goes for Bel'veth's taunt, where it's actually used much more explicitly. What she does is she turns her back, rises up, and then you see the fake head flop forward, and she turns around and does this big, like, monster scream at the enemy, because, like, that's what her taunt is supposed to look like. But here, the fakeness of the head is very explicitly used as part of the animation. You can even see, when she darts forward to be scary, you can see how the head is just flopping backwards like it's completely dead. So the artifice of the fake face is used very actively in Bel'veth's animation as part of her acting, and I really, really like this. It's not all sunshine and rainbows with Bel'veth's animation, though. With her in particular, I've noticed something that is present in all champions in League of Legends, I should say, but which is noticeably more pronounced with her, and I'd like to talk about it for a second. If you're paying attention to the way she's moving right now, you've probably already noticed it. This motion that she's doing right now looks kinda weird. This is her idle combat animation, i.e. when you take Bel'veth into combat, she adopts a different stance, a different set of movements, reacting to the fact that there are enemies present. This is the idle animation that plays when she's in combat, i.e. if you're in combat and you stand still and you don't do anything, first of all, you get reported for feeding, but also, this animation will play as she's waiting for you to give her another input. So, this is an animation that most players are not going to be seeing for like more than a fraction of a second at a time, because when you're in combat, you're almost never idle in League of Legends. Still, this animation looks a little bit janky and weird, doesn't it? And the reason why it looks weird has to do with the aesthetics of movement that are being deployed here. Specifically, pay attention to the tips of Bel'veth's wings as she moves. I'm going to slow it down for you. You see how when the wings get to the peak of their motion, like they move out, they move in, they move out, they move in, when they get to the full extent of their motion, they instantly switch direction back and move in the other direction. Like, there's no slowing down and then re-accelerating as they reach the peak. Like, if you try to do this yourself and you slowed down, like you took a footage of it and you slowed it down, what you would notice is that as you're moving your arms back and forth, you can't replicate that perfect snapping back and forth between two motions. Your arm is always decelerating, coming to a halt, then accelerating again to go in the other direction. There's a smoothness to it. And this is actually one of the fundamental principles of animation, is to use a certain aesthetic of easing from one motion to another to achieve a naturalistic look. The kind of motion that Bel'veth is doing here, that very static back and forth, that is mechanical motion. As an animator, it's motion that you would usually use if you were trying to communicate that something is a machine or is robotic. Now, of course, Bel'veth is not a human being. She's meant to be a void monster. But void monsters are also animated in the style of biological creatures. Specifically, Bel'veth is animated like a stingray. That's very specifically what she's animated after, and most of her animation also has that aesthetic of like that sort of floaty feeling of like being in the water and kind of moving like smoothly and slowly. But there are places in her animation where this is the movement aesthetic that rules instead. It's particularly egregious in this animation, so that's the one I chose, but it's present in other ones as well. Here we have her basic idle pose, the first one we examined, and notice how the tentacles at the bottom of her flesh skirt here, notice how they too are replicating that mechanical movement. They're going out, click, they're going in, click, they're going out, click, they're going in. It's something that's just in a lot of places in Bel'veth's motion, and I can't help but wonder why, because usually in League of Legends Champions, you can always find this kind of motion somewhere. Like, it's present in a lot of them, and part of the reason why is because, well, League of Legends, of course, is meant to be seen from this angle, and most people are not gonna notice or care. I want to stress that the criticism I'm framing here is not a big deal. It just caught my attention because most champions get a lot more polish than that. This is one of the things I love about League of Legends animation, is that you can pretty reliably take a champion into the model viewer and see a much higher level of polish in their animations than what is actually necessary. Bel'veth, though, has kind of a lot of situations, even ones where you wouldn't expect it, where this kind of mechanical movement aesthetic exists. For example, this is her dance animation, a place where normally the animators put quite a lot of extra time and polish into that one, because that's an animation that the players might look at. That's an animation that they might play in order to taunt their enemies, that they might use for something like promotional material when they're trying to sell the champion. And yet, look at the movement aesthetic. Look at how Bel'veth reaches a position that instantly switches direction back to the other one, instantly switches direction again, tick, 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 clicking away in a really mechanical way that just, I do wonder about it. Now, there's all kinds of reasons why something like this might happen. This is not the animator being bad at their job. I want to stress that. This is not anything to do with that. It's probably a thing about production. Bel'veth was produced, like many champions were, under the restrictions of COVID on probably a very weird time scale, with all kinds of restrictions and problems for the animators and artists to work around. So it's entirely plausible to me that the artists and animators just didn't have time to go through and hand polish every single one of her animations, even some of the ones where you normally expect them to, because like that's just how the production of the thing worked out. Sometimes that happens. That's normal in games production. It's a little, for me, it's disappointing because I am the weirdo who goes into the model viewer and looks at the champions in this way in slow motion, rather than play them in the game where it looks like this and it looks completely fine. It's just, Bel'veth is the first champion in a while I have noticed this with. Like, that kind of motion and movement is the sort of thing I associate a lot more with the older League of Legends champions, whereas the new ones are usually I associate with much higher production values in that way. Again, it's not a big deal, but this is one of the first times I have found pretty much anything to criticize about champion animation in a long time, so I thought I'd bring it up. This is the segment where we try to look ahead, try to divine where the future paths of a character may go, where we speculate in the pristine realm of ideas on what might one day be. In other words, it's the segment where I write fan fiction for ad money. And for Bel'veth, well, to a certain extent, the future is pretty simple. She's a big, bad-to-the-bone fantasy supervillain whose primary ambition is to end the world, and those villains have a tendency to end their stories only in one way: defeated by the heroes against all odds and in dramatic fashion. Now, that's not the only path forward for Bel'veth. Her story is to some extent about the ways that being exposed to reality changes void creatures, and her character design incorporates a direct visual split between a void monster side and a human side. So, in the long term, if one wanted to, Bel'veth's story could be about struggling with change. Say that she keeps consuming people over and over, and she adds more and more of what humans are to herself, and she begins to find in herself a strange sense of hesitation. Nothing rational has changed. The calculus is still the same. Her triumph is assured, and all will become part of her, and so on. But for some reason, she feels compelled to hesitate. The memories of her victims, which she has categorized and organized and contained as information, come to her all the time, unbidden and unwanted, showing her moments of pain, moments of hurt, moments of fear, and no matter how much she reanalyzes those memories, no matter how much she breaks them down, no matter how completely she understands them, they keep coming to her, and they make her hesitate. And it progresses to such a point that when she hurts another, so many painful memories experienced by her victims flood into her mind that she feels pain as well. Involuntary pain triggered by hurting others. Bel'veth develops empathy. And that doesn't necessarily have to turn her into a good guy or even make her stop being a villain who wants to rule the world. It just changes how she feels about it. And in that kind of a storyline, you can do interesting things, like you can play her human side and the void monster against each other, make her someone who's compelled by her nature to devour and consume, and compelled by her growing humanity not to. And every time the void monster wins and she consumes the living, the human side grows stronger as the victim is integrated into her. It could be almost like a reverse vampire narrative, where giving in to the dark thirst actually weakens the vampire. There's a lot of interesting emotional complexity you could explore there. There's a lot of identity themes, and it would dovetail nicely with the idea of Bel'veth as an expression of how the void itself is changing through interactions with reality. It would be an interesting subversion, and it would make her an interesting and somewhat more complex villain, but honestly, I don't think I want that. Like we talked about early in the video, the Void needs a supervillain. It needs a queen, an avatar, a final boss, and Bel'veth is just too good at that to use for anything else. At least I think so. So, for my money, her story kinda has to end with her final and inevitable defeat. But the circumstances and the manner of her defeat, I think, is where things get interesting. Villains often represent thematic challenges in their story. On the simple level, you get fairy tale villains like the big bad wolf, who represents the danger of talking to strangers and not doing what you're told, staying on the path. On the more complex level, you get Shakespeare's Macbeth, who's both protagonist and villain, and whose struggle with his own sins and temptations form the core of the play. Now, complexity doesn't equal good, and simple doesn't equal bad. Plenty of complex villains are actually really tedious and poorly written. Thanos from the MCU comes to mind for me, although you can probably think of your own examples. And while I think Bel'veth is on the simple side of supervillainy, being a monster who wants to eat the world, I think she could be defeated in a way that touches on the somewhat more complex themes of what reality means when it is set against the static non-being of the void. Let me set the stage. For our purposes, things have progressed more or less as you would expect them to progress. Bel'veth sent Kai'Sa to the Freljord to destroy the Watchers so they would not be a threat to her own conquest, and let's say that Kai'Sa has done that. She found Talia, who, having been in the Freljord before, guided her up there, and the two of them participated in the grand final stand against Lysandra and the Watchers in that region. And if you want to know how that whole adventure and confrontation might go, check out the What's the Deal with Lysandra video. Anyway, the Watchers are dealt with, much adventuring has been had. Kai'Sa and Talia have linked up with, say, Cillian and Jax, who are also gearing up to confront the Void, and just for the drama of it, let's say that Azir and Serath have been forced by the emergence factions of Bel'veth to temporarily put aside their differences and work together. And now the united armies of Shurima march against the swarms of Bel'veth's minions that are emerging from the desert. Nasus is there, Renekton is there, Sivir is leading bands of mercenaries. Hell, let's say that vel'koz and rek'sai both show up to try and destroy Bel'veth too, because she's a threat to their masters. So boom crash battle noises, magic flying everywhere, sand soldiers tearing into Voidborn. At some point, Zillion or Jax experience deja vu, like they're re-experiencing the fall of Acacia. Renekton furiously defends his brother from a horde of monsters, screaming, "Only I will have the pleasure of killing you." Azir and Zerath fight back to back, both of them quietly remembering doing the same as mortal men. Talia's tribe of Stoneweavers creates sliding rock bunkers for Sivir's mercenaries to fire out of. And if this is all not extra enough for you yet, imagine that Braum and Olaf show up on orders from Ashe and Sejuani, leading a group of Iceborn warriors who are all complaining about the heat, or that Yasuo dramatically animes himself into the fray because he heard on the wind that his pupil was in need of help. Imagine that deep below the ground, a tide of living rock washes over Bel'veth's reinforcements as they try to emerge and surround the heroes because Malphite has tunneled his way to the battlefield and is caving in their portals. Chip is there, he's helping. The point is, this is Endgame, the final movie of a great epic trilogy or something. It's the last alliance of elves and men marching on Sauron. You can go pretty much as ham as you want, so long as you do the legwork of setting it up beforehand, which we're just kind of skipping past because we're having fun writing fanfiction and not actually burdened with the responsibility of having to create the franchise of movies and TV show tie-ins that would have to lead up to the climax that we're imagining here. The battle rages back and forth, and our heroes enact their plan. Of course they have a plan. Everyone always has a plan when they confront the final villain. Talia and Kai'Sa bait Bel'veth away from her forces. Asir's army cuts off her retreat, and then in comes Jax, empowered by Cillian's magic, thundering down with the last light of Acacia. The lantern's mystic flames tear through Bel'veth's false face, and she screams, and with one cruel motion, she swats him away like a fly. It wasn't enough. In the time it took to defeat the Watchers, she has consumed too much, and she has grown too powerful. Her false head hangs limp off of her head as she assumes her full and monstrous form and turns her eyes on Talia. Her enormous mouth opens, and there is nowhere to run. Kai'Sa sees it all as if in slow motion, and everything that has happened flashes through her mind. Their travels in the Freljord, their struggles, every time they have helped each other up, every danger they have bested, every meal they have shared around a campfire. Her suit, instinctually, is screaming at her to run. Her survival instincts, which have ruled her life for decades, are on fire with fear and adrenaline. The fighter in her knows that it's over. The survivor in her is telling her to hide. And Bel'veth's enormous form is closing in on Talia. Kind Talia, optimistic Talia, funny Talia, her friend Talia, the first person who was willing to treat her like a human being, Talia. She doesn't make a conscious decision, but every ounce of her power fires from the thrusters on her suit, and like a bullet she streaks across the field, and even though it's pointless, even though Bel'veth will swallow the both of them anyway, she puts herself between the monster and her friend. The mouth envelops her, and she is gone. Imagine that what comes next all happens in a fraction of a second. The mouth has swallowed Kai'Sa, and now it's only inches from Talia, who has barely even registered what just happened. Everything that was Kai'Sa is torn apart within Bel'veth, deconstructed, broken into its constituent parts, and organized into the structure that is the beast. And it's not that there's anything that special about Kai'Sa, really. It's not that she's anything more than just another human. It's that in that moment, rushing towards certain death with nothing but the love for another tearing through her soul, Kai'Sa is the most human that she has ever been in her entire life. And like a bell that has been struck, her humanity reverberates through every soul that Bel'veth has taken. Every living life and memory, every heartbreak, every first love, every loss and bereavement, every stolen kiss in the moonlight, each sunrise, each eclipse, each twinkling glimpse of starlight, every moment of anger, every season of depression, every year of war, every decade of history, each drop of dew and blade of grass, and all the miracles and miseries and the all-encompassing cacophony of existence, it all rings out in resonance. When it is all deconstructed, when it's taken apart and categorized, sorted by atomic weight, The Void can understand creation. It can even imitate it. It can make monsters that look like animals. It can make cities in the Lavender Sea. But the infuriating impossibility of creation, the thing that makes it acid and poison to the Void, is that creation is more than the sum of its parts. That beyond that which can be merely measured, there is something, some unknowable, impossible connection that makes the difference between 1 trillion tons of gas combusting in a vacuum and that which we have named a star. Bel'veth stops the barest inch from Talia's body, and there is a moment of silence. Then, impossible shapes begin to carve themselves out of her body. She makes noises like whale screams and landslides. She convulses and spasms. Faces and objects flash into existence on her skin. Notes of music explode around her as though from an orchestra, and reality itself seems to bend around her body as the carefully constructed perfect order from which she built herself begins to buckle under the cascading resonance exploding inside her. Her senses and consciousness are overwhelmed by the pressure of millions of memories, by the significance of the eons of history that she has consumed. And as Bel'veth begins to tear under the strain, she does the only thing she can do. In absolute agony, she tears a rift between dimensions and flees into the Void, where without a sound, and with absolutely no drama, she falls apart and becomes nothing. Her minions scatter and die, the Lavender Sea collapses under its own weight, and the Void under Shurima shudders into silence as the death of Bel'veth forces the closure, if only temporary, of every portal and wormhole under the sands. Talia picks herself up and looks around, and as she realizes what it's cost to win this victory, she softly cries under the unforgiving sun of Shurima. That's one way to do it, anyway. Bel'veth is a monster who believes that the world only exists as she sees it and only for the purposes that she envisions. So let her be destroyed by the realization that reality is too complex, too chaotic, and incomprehensibly interconnected for any one person to own or control all of it. That it cannot be reduced to mere information. Let her be destroyed by the realization that the world doesn't revolve around her. In this version, we're basically casting her death as a conflict between absolute materialist, determinist nihilism and a somewhat more romantic and poetic understanding of the world, where poetry, for once, gets to win. Another approach would be to play on the idea that the Void doesn't understand reality, but that reality can comprehend the Void. So have her get taken out by Zillion and his sorcerer scientists, who finally manage to crack the magic math and quantum physics that they need to contain her. Or make it personal. Make it a personal showdown between her and Kaisa, where Kaisa, having trained and strengthened herself through trials and tribulations, manages to overcome Bel'veth anime style by realizing that for all her power and bluster once you see past the facade, Bel'veth is just another Void monster and can be killed like one. There's lots of ways to approach it. I've presented you with mine, and you can share yours in the comments. How would you end the story of Bel'veth? I'm curious to know. Oh, and do you want, like, a happier ending for Kaisa and Talia after all of that? I could write one, if you want. Let me know about that in the comments, too. I mean, personally, I think Bel'veth is pretty fantastic. Riot are having their cake and eating it too a little bit with the whole false face fake out, but it's really good cake, so I can't really begrudge them wanting a taste of it. Bel'veth is a great demonstration of an argument that I have been making for a very long time. A character's design, at least in media like League of Legends, should serve the purpose of telling their story. So Bel'veth has the fake pretty woman disguise, and that disguise certainly seems to be the face of her marketing and sales pitch, but it's also doing something for her storytelling. What I get out of it is that it is a window into her character, to her peculiar hypocrisy, that she's both above lying and yet presents herself with a lie, the tension between the humanity she has absorbed and the Void monster that she is by nature. It opens her up to interesting interpretations. It allows for interesting directions for her story. Which, of course, comes with the eternal Riot caveat that it'll be interesting if they actually develop it. I don't doubt the desire in their developers to do that, by the way, but I severely doubt that Riot Games Incorporated will spend the money and resources to actually do it. Arcane is a once-in-a-decade miracle from them. I don't expect we'll ever get anything like that for most champions. Especially not champions like the supervillains, whose stories have a tendency to be contingent on their defeat and destruction, or a full revolution of their status quo into something other than final boss supervillains. Which I suppose is sort of the bummer ending to most of these videos. The history of League of Legends is coming up on a decade and a half of tremendously talented people creating amazing characters with enormous potential for interesting storytelling, and then the corporation that owns them failing to capitalize on the vast majority of it. Riot Forge has shown us glimmers of hope. Ruined King was good, and like I said, I fully anticipate that Bel'veth is calculated to play the role of a major story raid boss for the MMO, but with Riot, it's always safer to assume that the opening chapter of a character's story is all that you're ever really going to get. C'est la vie, and that's why we take the power for ourselves and write fanfiction. If you want my final review, taken on her own terms, Bel'veth is a hell of a great villain design. Hey, thank you very much for watching another episode of What's the Deal? This one came together a lot quicker than they have been doing recently, which surprised me, but it's also good because, God, I've been slowing down so much on making videos, and it's really frustrating. I've been thinking about whether I should add skin reviews to these videos, because that kind of feels like it's part of the character, but the trouble is that, like, some skins are completely new characters and kind of need their own entire What's the Deal videos. Like, Star Guardian Lux, for example, which is, like, with all the Star Guardian stuff coming out, or the Odyssey version of Kayn. Like, they're completely new characters, so they kind of need their own thing. And if I'm just doing, like, shallow surface reviews on the skins in these videos, well, that's just kind of what I'm already doing with my shorts, so that feels kind of redundant. So, yeah, I don't know. Should I do, like, mini versions of What's the Deal videos for skins? Like, for skins that actually sort of warrant that? I'm literally never going to have time to do that, but I mean, I guess that's the kind of thing I could hire an editor to help me with. I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud because, well, normally in the outro I'd be saying all the like, comment, subscribe, Patreon stuff, but this video is sponsored, so I don't do that, but I still need the list of supporters to scroll so people get to have their names shown, so here I am talking to ya. Seriously though, write fanfiction, do it. My moral position is that characters and stories belong to the readers who love them as much as the corporations that hold the copyright, and fanfiction is one of the best ways to take that ownership. League of Legends has had so much trouble creating a strong fanfiction scene, and it's such a pity. The characters are good, and Riot sure as hell are leaving a lot of room for us to explore without them, and I really wish that more people would, do that. Anyway, I think the end screen has scrolled far enough, so if you made it this far, put a cactus emoji in the comments, and I'll put a heart on it. Obviously, that's an engagement tactic. It gets more comments, which gets the video more views, but also, I kind of want someone to be confused by why there's so many cactuses in the comments and why I'm liking all of them. Like, that's just kind of funny to me. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Wash your hands, take your vaccines, and try to act with solidarity towards those who are worse off than yourself.